All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good night, depending from which time zone you're joining this global conference. I think we're live. We're starting, and I'd like to welcome you to the session on governing industrial transitions. So we're going to have a roundtable debate, which is fully in line with the objectives of this TIPSI conference. We're going to bring together policymakers and scholars with an interest and experiences on governing industrial transitions, with the aim to see where we share some interest, where we have experience and lessons to learn, so that we can all move forward in understanding how industrial transitions can be governed. And this session is motivated by the very idea that there is a lot of interest for transformative innovation policies. They seem promising when it comes to transforming socio-economic systems or production consumption systems, which will eventually lead us to more sustainable and safe societies. The question, of course, is how to do this. And there's a particular set of challenges that we would like to address. The first one being this governance topic. So let me just put on my slides so that you can actually see the stuff I would like to show to you. So the motivation is that we want to understand better the governance challenges that come into play when governance, for instance, policymakers normally engaged or concerned with innovation policy or industrial policies, would like to contribute to transformations, and in particular transitions in an industrial context. That can be quite challenging, that's for sure. In terms of the roles they would have to play and the changes that will be needed, the changes in their capacities and how they organize themselves. And one particular problem that might be encountered often is how to also break away from the existing structures and systems that we have, which is, of course, interesting if you think, in the end, we're looking at transformation policies, innovation policies that have to do with, on the one hand, making use of all the capacities and knowledge that we have, and at the same time moving in a new direction. That's a delicate issue, and we would like to exchange some perspectives and views on how to go about. And the people who we invited are the following ones. Those are the speakers on our roundtable debate. The first one is Tatiana Fernandez. She's from the government of Catalonia. She's the head of economic development, and many of you might have seen her here in the TIPSI conference earlier, because she is not just applying a lot of transformative innovation policy and transition thinking, but also actually developing it. And she's a close friend in that sense of the TIPSI community, as well as other, I would say, communities that wonder about these topics. For instance, also the one that is coordinated by our second speaker, Dimitris Pontikakis from the EU Joint Research Center. He's in the Growth and Innovation team, responsible, I think, for many issues, but one of them is the working group on understanding and managing industrial transitions. So he has a lot of experience in developing methods and review protocols. The POINT project is one of them. He might mention that, for understanding how regions or countries can actually develop new pathways to give shape to industrial transitions. And the third speaker will be Tarun Thune from the University of Oslo. She's a professor at TIC, the Center for Technology, Innovation and Culture. And one of many projects she's involved in, or actually she's the director of, is INTRANSIT, which is a center for innovation policy for industrial transformation, sustainability and digitalization. I'm sure she will tell you more about that, because the format of the session is that those three speakers will start with telling a little bit of how they deal with the topic of governing industrial transitions. And then we move forward and discuss 4 particular themes, which I will introduce briefly before we kick off the roundtable. So the first one will be the question of transforming policy systems. So in order to transform systems and industries, also policy makers and policy organizations might have to do things different. So first we would like to hear about views, experiences and lessons when it comes to what does it take from the policy organizations themselves. The second topic we'll be then looking at is developing and co-creating actionable paths. So one way to drive a transformation is actually to figure out what industrial and scientific and societal partners think about possible ways to shape production consumption or socioeconomic systems, at least to move to a certain destination that is more sustainable or safe, or whatever societal challenge we're looking at. And the question is, what does it take from bringing actors together and finding out a path that looks promising enough and feasible enough? So what tools can be used and what tensions might be encountered, and of course, ideally, how can we respond to those tensions? Then the third topic is creating a supportive system, and that has to do, this topic, with which policy considerations in terms of governance, so steering and setting up interactions, as well as instruments, are relevant when we try to create systems that are needed to support a certain transition path. So if a society decides on a certain direction for moving into a more sustainable way of operating, how can this ideal system be supported? What policies are needed, and especially how do you line up these policies? And what is the role of both the policy and the non-policy actors? And then the final topic links to this core challenge of managing vested interest, which of course has this in a one-way negative connotation. At the same time, if we're looking at the innovation industrial part of transitions, well, we also want to make use of some of the strengths and assets that are already there. So it's again the question for what does it take from policymakers to actually navigate between moving away from what is undesirable and at the same time making use of what is still possibly relevant in a future production consumption system. So how to deal, for instance, with the losers and the winners of a transition. Those are the 4 topics. And let me now give the floor to our first speaker, Tatiana Fernandez, who will tell us a little bit on in general how she is dealing with industrial transitions. Welcome. Tatiana, one moment, because at least I can't hear you. Could you try again? Well, earlier it was working. Let me write about this. We do see you, but it's just a sound. Did you check, Tatiana, if you're not muted? I guess somebody's helping you, because otherwise I think putting up the mask is not helping for hearing you better. Okay, seems you're not muted from the, oh, what's that? You're not muted from the system side. Technical support is there. Okay, well, what I see is that you're calling an emergency line. So, well, somebody still says, could you press M? That's apparently, if you press M on the keyboard, that's a way to unmute. Tatiana, I think you can hear me, right? Because otherwise, exactly. We let's continue with first Dimitris, because I see you're still talking to someone. I'm not sure if you can test meanwhile, but that gives us some extra time to solve this. And there's Dimitris. Okay, are you ready?
Hello.
Oh, you thought you still had 10 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthijs. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dimitrios Montikakis. I work for the European Commission's Joint Research Center. The Joint Research Center, for those of you who do not know, is the European Commission's in-house science service. Our work at the JRC offers support to the member states to design and implement their innovation strategies. And for the last little while, myself and my colleagues have been helping EU member states with their so-called smart specialization strategies. I will therefore speak today from the perspective of someone who is at the interface between research and policy making. Within this context, 3 years ago, I began coordinating a working group of policymakers and researchers on understanding and managing industrial transitions. I will try to share my screen now and show you a slide that describes the group. I hope it's easy to see. Let me see. Hopefully you can all see it. The working group's core output was the so-called POINT, Projecting Opportunities for Industrial Transitions methodology, for reviews. These are studies that map an industrial system under a transformative framing of innovation. Their aim was to provide evidence and policy recommendations. The POINT methodology has now been tested in 4 pilot reviews in Andalusia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Romania. It benefited from the feedback of an advisory board of leading experts, including from TIPSI, the OECD, and of course Tatiana Fernandez, who is here with us today, and also Matthijs Jansen, both of whom co-authored the methodology. I would like to begin with offering very briefly some horizontal lessons across the pilot reviews because they have conditioned our thinking. I will single out 3 lessons. One is that there are many synergies between research and innovation policies as traditionally conceived and broader industrial policies, including business support, skills, and also policies that are outside the remit of industrial policy proper, such as infrastructures. And that coordination between this policy domain stands to amplify impact. Yet, these synergies are not easy to identify. The second lesson is the importance of local, regional, or national domestic demand for industrial development. The reviews show us that there are apparently many unexploited opportunities for profitable sequencing of policies. However, the coordination task within government is massive. It requires a new way of working across policy and across policy domains. The pilot reviews we have done so far have initiated reflections and discussions, both in the countries that engaged with us, but also at the European level. One outcome of this work at the European level is the development of a new generation of sustainable development strategies, what we call innovation strategies for sustainability, or S4. S4 strategies, which come after S3, after smart specialization strategies, build on and substantially extend upon the positive experiences with smart specialization. S4 places particular emphasis on actions with strong transformative potential. It focuses on the further development of aspects of innovation strategies, such as broad stakeholder engagement and mobilization, multi-level governance, synergies between policies and between funds, broad-based innovation, and the social dimension of innovation, and directions for innovation that lead to co-benefits for the economy, society, and the environment. Additionally, S4 seeks to accelerate transformative outcomes by introducing challenge-oriented innovation, such as local missions to coordinate actions under a single directional logic, exploring policy mixes that include interventions from outside the traditional confines of STI policy, promote innovation through regulation, and also explore demand-side policies. Why do we need S4? should come as no surprise to all of us attending this conference that we are living through exceptional times. We are all very much focused on the need to address climate change and do it, use the occasion of the deep transformations that are going to happen anyhow to create better futures for everyone. And it is also important to use the occasion to secure Europe's position in the economy of the future. And on that account, there is a confluence of maturing trends. There is a return of industrial policy, and the EU foresees its competitiveness as going through sustainability. There is a new scientific paradigm of innovation, thanks to all of you in the community of transformative innovation policy, that allows new narratives and new framings of innovation to emerge. And we believe that we are in a good position to bridge policy domains at the JRC because of our experience in engaging with the regions, but also at the national level. We need to act quickly. The clock is ticking. This new generation of sustainable development strategies, it will not suffice for them to merely bring us closer to transformative outcomes. We need to deal with very well-defined challenges and defined timeframes. We need to transform our economies within specific deadlines. We need to use resources in ways that create co-benefits for the economy, society, and the environment, and do all three things at once, not separately. We need to draw linkages and promote joined-up policy making, which is easier said than done. And there are probably good reasons why we don't do it on a business-as-usual scenario. But like I said, this is not business as usual. And we need to reform, revise, and complement policy and regulatory instruments to improve coordination and amplify impact. Myself and my colleagues are currently busily involved in the preparation of an initial guidance document for territories wishing to develop a new generation of strategies. It is forthcoming in May. The plan is to test it in a pilot. We're co-leading with the European Committee of Regions on several regions and countries who wish to voluntarily test key elements of S4 in their policy making. And without further ado, I will pass the floor again to Matthijs. And hopefully Tatiana can come back in now. Thank you.
Dimitris, that was very clear and excellent start to know where you're coming from. And I heard that Tatiana might be back with us. I mean, one thing that might work now and then is pulling the plug, but switching entire computer is even better.
Yeah, I changed the computer because it was impossible to control the other problem. Okay,
we're here now.
Thank you, and sorry for the inconvenience. So, as Mati said, I'm a policymaker working for the regional government of Catalonia in Spain. Catalonia is a dynamic and relatively rich region with 7 million inhabitants in Spain, and I'm responsible for the coordination of the Smart Specialization Strategy, which is the strategy that establishes the priorities for the regional European funds, and particularly for those funds oriented towards research and innovation. So our strategy is defined as a research and innovation transformative shared agenda oriented to address the challenges that really matter to people and to society. These challenges are huge, are weak, and complex. And if we want to address them, we need to take into account many dynamics at different levels, and also we need to take into account all their interactions. We have global challenges, such as climate change or aging population, and over these trends we don't have control. We have also the dominant socio-technical systems providing food, health, education, energy, each one with its institutions, practices, and norms and technologies, and they tend to be very stable and difficult to change. And then we have the emerging niches promoting alternatives that may challenge the dominant system, the regime. So I will share some slides with you. Okay. I hope you can see the slide. So what we observe in all territories, in Catalonia and also in other territories, is a dialectic between the dominant and the declining system and the alternatives that are emerging. These two-lock models that we see in the screen is a useful tool for policymakers to become aware of the different dimensions that need to be taken into account when dealing with industrial transitions. Transitions are not linear and are uncertain, and public policies don't have the capacity to direct them. Transformation is a very difficult and complex process, precisely because the sectors that need to be transformed are the ones concentrating jobs, concentrating knowledge, concentrating investments, and therefore they have to keep working, usually with public support. In fact, a large part of our industrial and research and innovation policies are focused on improving these traditional sectors and solving these many problems they generate. So policymakers have to continue supporting these activities that constitute the pillars of our economy, but at the same time, they have to support the emergence and the viability of alternatives. We are talking about new business models, new value chains, but also new social practices. Giving support and legitimacy to these alternatives so that they grow and consolidate is key. In most cases, the adoption of these alternatives will require adapting regulatory frameworks and institutional practices and will demand also to create new markets. Therefore, we need holistic approaches going far beyond research and innovation policies. So the world is changing so quickly, the future has become far less predictable than in the past, no? And there is much more information available and things are much more interconnected. And for policymakers, but also for researchers, it's very difficult to connect our actions to those problems and challenges that really matter. In this context, for me, the key question is not anymore about how do we improve research and innovation policies or how we improve industrial policies. For me, the key question is how do we change the dominant narratives, the dominant mindsets, in order to make it possible that policymakers, together with academia, with companies, with civil society, explore, co-develop, and implement more effective ways to address those challenges that really matter. We have to ask different questions. We have to take into account multiple perspectives. We need to see systems. We need to experiment. And very important, we have to manage conflict and expectations, because transformation is not built on consensus, but on managing conflict and on managing expectations and on co-creating new possibilities. Transformation is about challenging and destabilizing the dominant systems, and therefore the key question is not how to avoid conflict, but how to manage conflict. So what is our approach very quickly in Catalonia? The new Smart Specialization Strategy, which will be approved in the next week by the Catalan government, is focusing on transformative and responsible innovation and on the transformation of socio-technical systems. This strategy and narrative coexist with other more traditional sectoral strategies, and we are working with the Transformative Innovation Policy Framework, collaborating with Jordi Mola, Sandra Boni, Diana Velasco from Ingenio and Tipsy, and we are also working with Dimitris Pontikakis with the JRC. So our Smart Specialization Strategy provides legitimacy through a new narrative and provides also support, financial and methodological support, for new logics of interventions, for spaces in which stakeholders are encouraged to ask different questions, to integrate these multiple perspectives and to apply systems thinking, to experiment, to co-create and implement alternatives. These experiments and alternatives are the basis for elaborating new narratives and new evidences that can inspire and motivate other actors outside the niche to rethink business as usual. I'm talking about public administrations, researchers, companies, people. The interaction between niches and regime is key in transformative processes and industrial transitions. To articulate transformative action to tackle societal challenges, we find it very useful to work with transformative shared agendas that have similarities with ecosystem-based missions. So it would be a kind of missions. So the agendas are initiated by coalitions of diverse actors wanting to align on challenge. These actors create a shared understanding of how the current system works and co-create a shared vision for the future. What do they want to achieve together? What are the other relevant actors in the system? What are the dynamics of the system? What are the forces influencing the direction in which the system is moving? So when we are talking about complex challenges, there are not easy solutions, and no one knows what options are the best. To develop alternatives to current unsustainable practices, Stakeholders need to experiment with new ways of doing, with new ways of using technologies, with new ways of organizing. They need to build a niche, a safe space for experimentation to explore and learn what works and what does not work. And in this process of the shared agendas, it's very important not to lose perspective, because the final goal is system transformation. Experimentation is not just about exploring technical new solutions, but also about exploring social acceptance, about exploring behavioral change, about imagining new ways of organizing our society, and about opening and destabilizing the dominant systems. So government and public administrations play an important role, providing narratives, legitimacy, financial support, adapting regulatory framework and institutional practices, and connecting the shared agendas with our initiatives at local, regional, national, and international levels. And the dynamics happening in the shared agendas are a very important source of knowledge to inspire policies and actions to effectively manage industrial transitions. Thank you.
Okay, I guess it's me. My name is Tatiana Fernandez. I'm a professor at the University of Oslo. And thank you for inviting me to this panel discussion. I'll share a few slides as well, see if I can do that. I hope that you can now see my slides. So I'm from the University of Oslo. I am a director of large 8-year research center called INTRANSIT. And we work specifically on this topic of research and innovation policy for green industrial transformation. And let me just say a few words about what we do before I come into the more policy-related questions. So INTRANSIT is a research center hosted by the University of Oslo, where I work at the TIC Center, but it also has partners in multiple institutions, including the Copernicus Institute of Sustainability in Utrecht, and 2 Norwegian research partners, SINTEF Digital and the Institute for Informatics. We're about 25 people, and we've been working on these issues connected to sustainability and kind of both digital and sustainable changes from an industrial perspective. So what we do is we follow in detail and work closely with existing industries. So what we within our field of practice and research often define as kind of incumbent industries. So rather than working specifically on kind of technologies or the knowledge base, we kind of go in and work within specific industry sectors. And in particular, we kind of work on and with actors within the energy sector, the maritime transport sector, within manufacturing and bioeconomy. So we do a lot of mapping and investigations, empirical and more conceptual, into what kind of green transition processes are actually going on within these industries. And we're particularly interested in the varieties of industrial transformation processes and how that can feed into policy questions. We also focus quite a lot on the actors themselves, particularly incumbent firms, and how they collaborate with kind of newly started, what we often define then as kind of niche firms, and also look a lot on the collaboration. One, I guess, particular issue within this research center is that we look at both kind of green transformation, but also the role of digital transformation and the interconnection between digital transformations and green changes within an industry perspective. So just a few points, and I'm not going to go into detail there. My main point is that when we talk about industry transformation processes, we have to be mindful that these are very different because industries in themselves are very different. So rather than thinking about one size fits all type of policy approaches to industry transformations, one has to be mindful of the fact that the structure of industries, the institutional framework conditions, the size and resource base, the degree of global interaction and so on are so different. Then if we really want industries to change in a greener direction, you need to kind of have quite a detailed knowledge and insights into how those dynamics within those industries are affected by green pressures and so on. So in INTRANSIT, we compare and work with very kind of well-established industries, and we can see very clearly that they are very different. So the oil and gas sector, for instance, that I've been working a lot on, it has a completely different pattern of how it can transform than if you compare it, for instance, to maritime transport or aquaculture. So I think it's important when we talk about this from a policy context is that the details are quite important. In addition, if you compare industries, you see a huge differences between them. You can also see quite significant differences between different firms that occupy the same industry. And here is just an illustration from the oil and gas sector that I've been working quite a lot in. If you compare different types of firms, you would see that their transformation processes are really different. So in this case, it's a comparison between an oil and gas firm, Equinor, which is a big European oil and gas company based in Norway, and a service company. So it's also, you compare industries, they're very different. If you compare firms within those industries, they're also very different. And this has a lot of importance for policy making. And in Transit, we work, as I said, not only about doing research on industry transformation, we also work quite a lot with kind of collaboration with the policy actors, with industry actors, and do a lot of outreach activities and so on. So this is kind of a bit about what we do in this specific research center. I was also asked by Matthijs and colleagues to say something about kind of the framework conditions for industrial transformation policies. And they are very different in different countries as well. Kind of my country, and I guess this is a bit of the similar thing from other Northern European countries, that they have a tradition for policy development and governance, which might be quite specific to the context in which they emerge. So in my country context, you know, I guess most of you know this, Norway is kind of one of the few European countries that has a considerable oil and gas exploration activities and then export a lot of gas in particular, but it's also this kind of renewable giant, green giant image, because we also have a lot of renewable energy. So this is kind of, you have to deal with this very paradoxical situation. It has a lot to do with policy and how you kind of balance different policy concerns. What is quite important when we talk about governance of industry transformations is that in the Nordic countries, and I guess that might be partly the case in other countries, that you have already a set and institutional way of doing policies. And in the Nordic context, it's very much to do with this kind of tripartite collaboration principle. So you have a welfare state, you have kind of a lot of policy instruments connected to the kind of development of the economy, and then you also have quite a substantial and very traditional way of interacting. So some of these principles that's actively promoted in the transition literature that has to do with collaboration and integration and so on, negotiation of different interests and frameworks, that is already an institutionalized kind of way of doing policy, which also make it kind of an opportunity to take on these new kind of ways of thinking about policy development and implementation. So that's already kind of an existing framework condition. And I guess at least if you compare it to certain kind of Anglo-Saxon countries, the Northern European countries and Norway perhaps in particular has it's a tradition for very active industry policy. So it's compared to kind of other countries where you have a much more laissez-faire model. Here it's kind of a lot of investment from government bodies into specific industries, into lead firms and so on. So that is kind of the basis that when we talk about the importance of industry transformation policies, you have to take account that there's kind of economic resources, there's a policy tradition and so on that directly influences how industry transformation policies might unfold. In my country, as well as in other European countries, you already also have substantial resources, very well-developed welfare state, which is important because you really want transitions, but you also want to keep jobs and a high level of public welfare. There's a high level of education and quite pervasive use of technologies. And also, which is quite important in this specific context, that there is also very kind of sector principle, as it's called in governance. So you have a very close vertical integration of stakeholders, but you have a limited tradition for horizontal across different policy domains and also across different industrial sectors. So in Norway, you have this very emerging consensus about what we need to do. So everyone is on board, from all the way from political parties to industry actors to research communities to kind of think tanks, the media, and so on. So in general, there is really a consensus that it's important to do kind of substantial changes to greening industry. And there's a lot of cross-sector collaboration. It's a lot of collaboration between policy and NGOs and firms and NGOs to kind of try to come up with concepts. So in this context, it's not really a problem that we have diverse opinions about whether or not we need to have these green industry transitions. The whole question is about how to do it, right? And that's a much more complicated question. So I guess we're already kind of past that kind of having a consensus about what we need to do, but it's the kind of key question on everyone's lips is kind of, yes, we know what to do, but how to do that. So I'm looking forward to the questions that we will go into. I guess we will partly touch on some of these questions later, so I'll go back to some of these points about different governance tools a bit later. Just an example of this very kind of inclusive way of doing policy. We have institutionalized an approach to do this in innovation policy in Norway. So when you do develop technology strategies and industry policies in specific industries, you already have a very broad consultancy process. So a lot of firms, a lot of experts, a lot of public agencies, a lot of kind of NGO within environmental issues are involved in making tender strategies for how to make investments in different sectors and how to transform them. So in this, in our context, this kind of approach to doing a very kind of deliberate integration and negotiation across interest to develop joint targets and so on is fairly well developed. But I can get back to some of the details there.
Very clear story on how you're working with these topics. And I think with this, we can move to the roundtable part of this roundtable session. We don't have an actual table, obviously, but we can still sit around each other virtually. And before we do that, let me just also notify the audience of the invitation of Iris in the chat to not only ask questions and post comments that we can pick up in the part of discussing our focal topics, but also just letting us know who's actually in the audience. Since you can see us, we can see you, and it's always nice to know which kind of scholars or policymakers we have. So please feel free to tell us who you are. Let's go to the first topic, which is on transforming policy systems. So what does it take from the policy side? And if I may, I would like to go to Tatiana, since you start from an economic development background, and I have the impression you've seen pretty much a big evolution in terms of thinking, new priorities. So I'm very curious, is it just you? Is it also your colleagues? And can you tell us a bit about that part of the transition you're looking at?
I have to say that the view that I have expressed is not the overall view in public administration in Catalonia. We would like this would be, but not. But what we have achieved is, so as I say, I'm coordinating the Smart Specialization Strategy, and this is a transversal strategy for the whole government, and it's a strategy in which stakeholders are the main actors. So research centers, universities, municipalities, companies. So it's a very transversal policy, and it has been very important to create these new narratives because we have money there, we have new narratives, and we have some small niches. With the shared agendas, there are many things emerging in the territory, actors starting to think, what is our shared vision? What is the future that we want for our territory in rural areas, in small towns? So it's it's about a strategy that when you have a narrative, emerging things happen, new things happen. And if you, from the regional government, give an umbrella and help them to connect with each other and to make sense of what they are doing, they are growing bigger. So that we are building like a coalition of actors for transformative change. In the last period, our smart specialization strategy was not so transformative, but we had some experiments that grow a lot. And we have started this new strategy one step further. Our rationality and logic of intervention is transformative innovation. And there are always more actors coming to us asking how they can do it. And in this case, capacity building is very important. The collaboration between public administration with researchers, that there is always more people talking this language. So we are collaborating a lot with TIPSI, with the people from Ingenio in Spain, with Jordi Mola, Sandra Boni, who are in many of these other discussions, with Diana. And they are working directly with the shared agendas, with the actors in the territory, with these municipalities, universities, wanting to transform things. So it's not easy, it's not mainstreaming, but we are always more people and building these new narratives, providing these umbrellas at the regional level, connected to these international initiatives, so that we are connected with the TIPSI theory of, with the theories of change of transformative innovation policy. That's something happening at the global level, also working with the JRC. It's helping a lot. So there are many people working. If we provide a big narrative, there will be more people because there is not other option. So this would be my answer.
Okay, that's great. Taran, what about your experience? You told us a bit about the Nordic model. That's a particular way of doing policies. Does it lend itself for transformative innovation policies, or is it an example even for other places? Or how do you feel about this model and the idea that sometimes policy making actually also needs to be adjusted?
Yes. I guess it's a bit yes and no. So it's on one side, it's a kind of a very kind of inclusive process. So a lot of that kind of that is often seen as kind of a message from this literature is that you need to bring the different stakeholders together and have a kind of a fruitful discussion between different perspectives and so on. And this is already, as I said, kind of institutionalized in the way of doing policy in the Nordic countries. And so it's this logic of representation of different stakeholders. Every kind of decisions, even down to kind of very narrow ones and very limited ones, they're always based on that. It's always then it's also a challenge that the process is quite slow, because you need to include, and you have everyone who's affected by something can make kind of, you can actually write as a citizen, you can write kind of to the government and say something, well, I don't want this, and so on. So it takes a lot of resources. So it also is about the capacity of the kind of the policy making organizations to weed through an enormous amount of information, right? So I think that's definitely worthy of taking it. So I think it has some strength, and I think if you really want to do these complicated, large-scale changes, you need to go through this. But then again, we have limited time, and it's difficult to rush it. But I think it has both good and bad. And one thing that I think is quite important in terms of the capacity, it really needs some kind of investment from very high level in the policy hierarchy. So you really need someone with a kind of this visionary who has a bit of political clout, who can really get the different partners together. So I think that's a bit of a resource question. Is not only down at the agency level. It kind of needs to be it needs to infuse the whole kind of, even to the parliament level and at the kind of top level of the government in our experience.
All right, that's interesting. Also the idea that if you would rely really a lot on the visions and view and preferences of the field, it actually takes a lot of resources to take that all in, because sometimes it might seem, okay, that's fine, then the government has to do less because it's the field that raises their views and the roadmaps. But you're saying don't underestimate what you need to do there.
Yes, and it's also a deliberation process. So my experience is you have to deliver the same message so many times in so many discussions, and then it becomes kind of a I think Tatiana said something about the language or a kind of perspective that's taken for granted. And at least here, I guess it's in many countries, you have that kind of industry policy as such might be quite contested as a policy field. So you have this tradition that the market will take care of everything, and even within innovation policy. So even discussing with the Treasury, the Ministry of kind of, it takes time to have some kind of everyone on board that this is an appropriate way to do economic policy making. And I guess you will find that in many countries as well. So repetition is important.
Okay. But I still hope Dimitris is going to tell us something different. I know you've been looking at, you know it's difficult to change. Have you encountered already some eye openers or?
I'm not sure I can surprise you. I'm not sure I can surprise you. But as you know, bringing about change in policy systems is not easy. Doing the usual business of government, delivering the key functions of policy, while at the same time innovating within policy systems and transforming them is very hard. There are many reasons why change is difficult. I think leadership and the development of directionalities that various parts of society can rally behind and exert pressure on government to change its ways is key. And paradoxically, the government has a role in nurturing these directionalities, strengthening them so they grow and they build broader coalitions. And although our societies are in many respects richer and smarter than they were in the past, a few decades at least, we have lost something of our collective capacity to imagine, and I think much less construct positive futures. There is a great need for positive futures, for imagining futures that are good for the economy, but also for society and for the environment. Importantly, that all three things are done at once, that we don't try to compensate for damage done to the economy or social tensions that emerge from economic growth with a project that will later on pick up the damage. That we try and build it into our development work from the very beginning. We make it integral to our development work. To do that, it's a new framing of innovation is important. And I know that I'm now here preaching to the converted, but we find that this is also important in policy-making settings. And this is the kind of advice, if you want, or discussions that we have with many policymakers across Europe. And we need to perceive the system, the production and consumption systems that need to change differently than has traditionally been done. It's still very difficult to disengage from traditional framings of innovation. They're very entrenched. So there is an element of unlearning that needs to happen, and of decommissioning, if you like, elements of policy systems that are no longer relevant, and repurposing them. And this is extremely hard. This is extremely hard. We're under no illusions about how hard this is. And it is fair to say that we can introduce changes in small doses, but it also takes a political ambition to try to be bold and to try bigger changes, and that's the prerogative of policymakers everywhere. And these are hard choices that they have to take together with stakeholders.
Okay, those are definitely original points. And just quickly getting back to this first issue of sometimes transformation needs to happen alongside the key functions of policy making. Have you come across ways to actually embed it in those key functions and make it part, rather than burdening policymakers with yet another task that is perceived as something competing or distracting. Maybe it's the narratives of Tatiana. I don't know. Would you know some?
May I say something? There is also a question for me in the chat. So I was explaining our smart specialization strategy, which is about generating alternatives to unsustainable current practices. Because if we are talking about transitions is, there are some industries that are decaying, that have no future, but we cannot talk about transitions if we don't build alternatives, because that is the question. In a territory, you need to build alternatives. If we close these industries, what can we do? What these people are going to do? So for me, because the question was like, oh, this is like elite policies only for the educated people. No, it's a discussion also in rural areas. We have the same problem as in Netherlands, a high specialization in pig farming, contaminating all the soil. And people say, yeah, if we close those farms, what these territories are going to do? What are we going to export? Because there are not alternatives there. So for me, the issue is to generate alternatives, because we say, okay, we can close that, but we have, look at these other farmers that have alternative models that are more sustainable and they are successful. So for me, it's a dialogue between the old and between the new. We cannot choose between the two. We need to work in parallel with all the instruments that we have as policymakers. And of course, we have to support the old industry, because they concentrate the employment, they concentrate the knowledge, the investments. We cannot close down all these industries. But we don't need to forget, we cannot forget to build new things, to build new alternatives, to help the emerging to grow, to build these niches, to expand them so that they can open the system and provide alternatives. And both things are so important. And our problem is that researchers, because many researchers are focused on solving the problems of the old industries. Please, we need to change focus. How can we build alternatives so that then transitions are easy? Because you say, okay, you cannot work here, but you have capacity building, there are jobs in these other sectors, you can switch. But if there is nothing, then for me, it's not one thing or the other, but it's how we work with the whole system, creating opportunities and helping the old to die and to make this transition. It's difficult, but we should start thinking about this in these terms.
Wonderful. And I think that also, this involves envisaging paths for everyone. So that brings us a bit to the second topic also. I think all of you have told us a bit about certain methods or tools or practices to let many actors participate in finding out where could we go. And I'm just wondering, is there a main lesson or takeaway so far from your experience? For instance, what I would wonder is, you can have many actors on board in developing roadmaps or visions, but how do you also get their commitment, and how do you prevent that just actors show up and contribute to the paths, but in the end don't really invest in those jointly charted paths? Someone of you, Taryn, would you like to respond to that?
I think you're pointing to what is quite a dilemma there, because we put a lot of emphasis on this kind of involvement in the kind of process connected to developing strategies and so on. But that's not at all the same as getting different stakeholders to commit to actions. And I think it's one has to work along several lines. I think it's not one process that we can implement elsewhere. So I think we have to think about that. We need a very big toolbox, right? And then you need to kind of try many different approaches. And I think it's easier if you work on that kind of R&D innovation policy tools, because it's easier to kind of make an agreement about what could be an important kind of next step in a process. So I think it's also about the nature of those policy tools. So and then I guess it's the regulatory instruments which actually makes the fastest impact in terms of actually committing firms and industries to actually pollute less, or kind of these things. And so I think one has to work from very many different perspectives. And some of the instruments you would have people, or you would have the firms and stakeholders to kind of buy into and be part of a process. And other ones, I think it's just you just have to kind of be set an end to something, and then industry will change automatically because they have to, or there's a tax regime, or there's some kind of things that. So you have to push, and you have to kind of stick and carrot kind of thing. I think it's a balance there.
All right. Dimitris or Tatiana, you have anything you would like to add to this topic of participating with a lot of actors to find a certain path? Okay.
I would like to say something, because something that we have learned is that we cannot implement transitions based on consensus. We cannot wait until have consensus, because if we want to have consensus, then transition is not possible, because consensus is about maintaining the status quo. It's about letting out the people with no power, because those with power, the big companies, the big sectors, the big players, have no interest maybe now into allowing other incomers come to the ground, to the playground. So for me, this is something that we have learned. It's that we need to identify where is the energy, where there are people with new ideas, investors that want to try new things, that are opening these emerging opportunities and helping them to growth and supporting them into building we don't know what, but not waiting for the consensus, because in our countries, it's very different. I think it's very different, the culture for Norway from the South Europe, because there is no consensus. Institutions, politicians have no credibility, and there is a lot of polarization. So we are all, you ask, and everybody is for the SDGs, but when you talk about the agricultural sector, we are producing pigs, and we are going to produce pigs, because if someone says, oh, maybe we should think that, all the press, all the politicians, all the people are against changing that. So then no consensus, that is not possible for transitions, and looking where there is energy for change and helping and support this energy and those actors who wanted to change things. And then let's see what happens. That's my main learning in the last years working in this field.
All right, and being open to all these newcomers and where the energy for change actually is, does that also mean not being open to the one who might be more reluctant to change?
Yeah, I think that it's, as I say, it's a dialogue. It's not between choosing this or this. You need policies for all. Of course, you have to maintain and help the big industries, the big players, because it's where the jobs are and the investments are. But not forgetting that it's a huge responsibility, because to help the new to emerge. And this new can inspire also the old ones, because when they see it's like the green economy 20 years ago, to talk about the green economy in Spain was like, what are you telling? This is not sustainable for business. It's not about business, green economy. And now everything has changed. So if there are no alternatives emerging, it's impossible that they all make the change. They need to see the alternatives. They have to be viable. They have to attract new investors. And we need to reorient resources from the old to the new. And the policies is about all that. It's with and with. It's not this or that.
All right. And Dimitris, you already shared your views on collective imagination. Of course, that also has to do with creating pathways and horizons. Any tips or tricks?
Yeah, no, these are unlikely views for an economist on collective imagination, but these are very important. The way we perceive problems, policy problems, are very important. To, so to speak, to think out of the traditional box and to create our own box according to the problems that we have faced, the problems that local communities are facing in transitioning, and the problems that local industry is facing in reaping the opportunities that this future economy holds for them. Obviously, policy cannot have a prescriptive role about who wins and who loses. It does, however, have a role in opening viable paths for everyone that chooses to follow them. And I very much agree with Tatiana that it's very important there to open up alternatives, to provide alternatives. In addition to helping incumbents transform themselves and find their way in the future, it is very important to open alternative paths. And importantly, this holds the key to win-win-win outcomes, as I like to call them, which are good for the economy, for society, and for the environment. And it surprises me very often that in a lot of the discussions about industrial transitions, trade-offs are emphasized. And of course, the trade-offs are there. But what is not widely appreciated and is very much the preponderance of at least the studies I have seen, I cannot say that they are comprehensive, show there are very sizable net benefits in terms of employment creation in the green transition in particular. So this by the International Energy Agency and many others have found very large co-benefits. It's not turning green or having jobs. It's actually both. And this transformational policy, therefore, it's very important that it incorporates elements of other policy domains. Innovation policymakers are not well prepared to handle these transitions. We need skills and employment policies. But historical experiences from energy transitions in particular, and there's another question about this in the chat, have shown us that even these are not enough. Because a very common outcome for sizable parts of the workforce that is undergoing transition, sizable parts of this workforce cannot transition. So there's an important and there's a need for a frank discussion about the role of social welfare, of welfare policies there. And if the economic benefits are so huge, you can certainly afford it. I can certainly mention one example. I can mention one example, a very powerful example of a recent study in the Lancet that looks at the costs and benefits of implementing the Paris Agreement. And it finds that when you do a cost-benefit analysis and you look into the benefits in terms of the health benefits of improvements in air quality, that the economic value of these benefits is twice as large as the cost of implementing the Paris Agreement. So in terms of improving our health alone, it makes economic sense. So it's the wicked problem is convincing, is making the case for the transition and imagining these futures. That's why I emphasized it so much in my earlier intervention. And policy has a role there in building the policy intelligence infrastructure, supporting researchers that produce this evidence. So broad communities of stakeholders can navigate these in ways that maximize the opportunities and lower the costs and the risks.
Okay, excellent. And I guess from this example, it would also mean that policies would have to look into how can we, well, distribute the benefits of, in this case, having better health, because the cost will be made in a different place than those benefits. And I guess it naturally doesn't sum up. So that will be actually a policy priority then, probably, to square it. Okay. Yeah, let's move to the third topic, if there's, because you automatically already picked up the questions in the chat. So creating a supportive system. So if you know which alternative you want to pursue, if you know which path might look promising, typically, as you have been pointing out, that would require a whole set of policies, education, maybe laws. So, well, before I introduced a few things we could discuss about this, but I'm particularly wondering, what if you don't know yet? It's a moving target, because often in transitions, you don't really know which path you're going to choose or which alternative. So how can you arrange a accommodating set of policies around a path that is still dynamic and moving? But if you have other thoughts on on this issue of streamlining a whole balanced set of policy or a balanced policy mix, I would also be curious. Somebody who would like to respond to or kick off?
I can start, say a few
Please.
things. I guess I've made somewhat of the same point already, that I think it's important to kind of, at least within these mature sectors where you're looking at, whether it's in transport or it's in industry and so on, that to look kind of broad perspective of what the tools could be, right? And kind of focusing both on the supply of new things and the demand, and particularly pushing kind of the demand side to actually experiment or take on board new solutions. So one of the things that we're quite interested in is to look at collaboration across kind of established sectors or established firms and newcomers, and try to create more kind of platform policies where it's easier to kind of connect and tap into and push the kind of end user sectors to actually pick up new technologies. And I guess it's one of the problems with the policy making is that they're very specific to a technology field or a sector. So they build up support tools around that kind of domain. And it's very few policy instruments that are set up to kind of connect and diversify existing sectors while also stimulating new coming firms, for instance. So that's one of the kind of things that I would like to see much more about, is experimenting with cross-industry kind of platforms. So there's a few initiatives, I guess, in Norway and elsewhere that try to kind of use this more kind of platform policy concept, where the intent is to diversify existing sectors, while also providing kind of market opportunity for newcomers. So that's at least kind of, because it tries to focus on both on the supply side of new technologies, but also on the demand side, and kind of, I think that's an example of something which I think is a way forward.
Okay, and you're looking at different sectors. Do you see that the policy mixes in some sectors are much better or more balanced or consistent than in other sectors? Are there large differences, or are the struggles the same and the policies the same?
I think they're of course they're always different. If you look at the details, they're always different. But I think it's also a bit of a kind of, particularly those industries that are very kind of investment and equipment heavy. There's a lot of sunk cost and so on. This is a much more complicated story about kind of, it's difficult to change priorities when there are billions of investment in kind of equipment and these things. So other industries that are much more kind of, they can turn around much faster and take on new technologies. It's a completely different story. You can kind of transform them much quicker. So that is at least a fundamental industry difference. But I think also these heavy equipment end user sector, for instance, such as oil and gas, they're definitely willing, or at least some of them are willing, to experiment into new markets and take on board new suppliers or technology vendors into that process. But it takes time, of course, and so I guess that's at least kind of important, that kind of the material structure and the investment that's already there, they matter quite a lot. And we tend to forget that it's a lot about natural resources, it's a lot about the natural environment, and it's about kind of the things that's already put into the ground, so to speak. So, and we don't talk about that in a policy context, but it's actually very important framework conditions for what we can do and what we can change.
All right, Dimitris.
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to make a point about demand that Taran raised, and I think it's a very important point. I think the demand side is very important in these industrial policies, and because it can help reduce uncertainty, knowing more about demand and because I think a key point is that predictability is uneven in different stages of industrial transition. Early on, there are myriads of possible paths, but they tend to narrow down over time, and they require very different policy approaches along the way. And demand is very important. Why? Because it's a policymakers that it's a lever that policymakers have. They routinely subsidize demand, especially for the green transition, but seldomly use the occasion to open up new paths for industrial development in their country or region. For example, the public purse routinely pays for, fully or in part, for large physical infrastructures, for energy, transport, and waste. And we know that these investments at this point in time are predictable. A lot of these will be for energy storage, for example, to accommodate the greater penetration of renewables. It is not a mystery what these investments will be in the coming decade. What is not appreciated, however, is that these investments can open up experimentation spaces and potentially play a key role for system-level innovation in a region or a country. So they can strengthen a territory's unique niches and allow for experimentation, prototyping, and a first chance for real-world rollout, and support skills development, and even point the way to regulatory reform. So it's very important to bring them under the umbrella of innovation policy, and to plan jointly under a common directionality these investments that creates these positive futures. It's very hard. It's very hard because it requires thinking more like engineers and less like economists. And not all these levers of change are available in regions. A key role of national governments, which requires multi-level coordination and joined-up policy making to pull the right levers. Indeed, some of these levers are new and temporary because we're undergoing a deep transition, and many of our fundamental socio-technical systems in food, housing, energy, transport, and waste are changing in ways that we haven't seen in decades. If we don't pull these levers and make these changes as we're making these inevitable investments, the window of opportunity may close and may stay closed for a very long time. So now is the time to do them. How do we do them together with the communities that are affected by them to create desirable futures? This is the key question, I think.
I would like also to add something that when I listen questions like we should choose the pathways for the future, I ask myself, who should choose these pathways? Politicians? Incumbents? Big players? Because the people with power are if we have to decide something, the people with power are the best place to define these pathways. So that's why it's so important, I think, to open spaces for these experimentations, but not experiments like different things happening. To provide a narrative, we need a clear directionality, and the SDGs, the Green Deal in Europe provides a very clear directionality where we want to go. And then I think we should focus on challenges, because when you focus on challenges that the territory has, automatically all people have to coordinate, because if we have this challenge, researchers cannot solve it by themselves, politicians cannot solve them, companies cannot solve. So to identify challenges and then rethink how we can address this challenge together in different ways, because we are here because we have caused this situation. So continuing doing the same, we are not going to solve anything, or discussing, we are not doing or solving anything. We cannot wait until having consensus. We need to recognize the challenges and ask different questions about how or what can we do in different ways together to address these challenges. And in each territory, it will be different, probably. But this is why it's so important that we have common narratives, that we have a common understanding of how transitions happen, what can help transitions, what is important in all territories, because some things are universal for all the territories. And this is, I think it's very important to have this common framework that, for example, TIP is providing, no? Because this helps us to exchange experiences, to make general recommendations, to understand what is happening here works, there doesn't work, why it doesn't work there and here, yes. There are differences in culture, there are differences in, because it's very different for a small country, like, for example, Catalonia, Norway. Many of the population is the same, but for example, in Catalonia, we don't have policy instruments because all the big decisions are in Madrid, and Spain is very big. There are very different regions with different necessities. So who is going to decide what are the pathways? And I think that we need to look at the local connected to the global, because at the local level, different actors have more other kind of relations and can develop together new solutions. But the regional, the national governments, the European Commission, the global institutions need to look and make a connection and extract learnings and providing different ways of financing these kind of things. We need to rethink many things. It looks maybe that what we are doing is that it doesn't work. So we need to rethink and ask ourselves different questions, I think. Thank you.
Okay. Of course, you're also free to react to each other. Let me just react to Dimitri's. I think it was a very convincing story that public demand might be the key, because there's just so many opportunities and resources there. But still, to challenge you a little bit, what could policy makers do when it comes to non-public demand, so private demand? Are there some strategies or policies to bring more to the surface where untapped private markets are that could be interesting for targeting transition pathways? I realize it's just out of what you just have been promoting. So if you say, you missed the point, it's fine.
No, but it's very important also. But I think that the most urgent thing is to help to change mindsets. When we are, for example, we are working on the agro sector, how can we reorient it to the circular economy and to the bioeconomy, our primary industrial sector? And then many questions arise because everybody talks only about their part of the thing, no? But we had discussions with many different stakeholders, and the role of the demand, or the private demand, what the consumers are demanding, is very important. So if consumers don't understand the challenges of their territory, if they don't make the connection that what they are eating or what they are demanding is causing all these problems that they are complaining, and their behavior that is causing many other problems, we're not going to change anything. So for me, the most urgent thing to do is a change of mindset, change of narratives, that people connect things. Because in our way of working and of analyzing and of making policy, everything is disconnected. We think with linear thinking, no? We need to see the system and think that everything is connected, and we cannot wait that the governments provide the solutions. We as citizens, as investors, as educators, as public servants, as entrepreneurs, we all share the responsibility to change something. And this change of mindset should activate another kind of demand that should make transitions faster, no? The role of citizens is very important, and the role of consumers is very important. And if the private are not asking for different products or for different ways of producing, it's difficult that the industry is going to change. So everything is interrelated. I don't know.
So are you implying that then the innovation and industrial policy should go as far as, I don't know, campaigns, or should they reach out to the customers and the final demand? Or
I think that we need a mix of policies. I think that we need a mix of policies. When we see that we have a problem in our territory because the industry is contaminating all the soils, that what the people are demanding is not good for the environment, or that there are so many complaints about many things, you need to work with the consumer. So when we are working with all the stakeholders, we are also have to work with them. So they cannot complain that there are not companies or the region is poor if they are buying their products from other countries and they are not buying from the local producer. So with their decisions, they are affecting their territory. They need to make this connection that their decisions as a consumers have a big influence of the model that we have in the territory. And for that, we need to work with schools, of course, We are working with schools, making awareness to the children that there are campaigns, of course. We need to work also with consumers associations. It's not that we cannot segment. We should look at the challenges that we have and to understand that these challenges have many dimensions: investments, industry, consumers, education is very important. So all of us have a shared responsibility, and we need to start these different discussions, because I think it's very, only to ask that policymakers have to do everything and have to guide industrial transitions. No, we live in a world of high uncertainty, of radical uncertainty. And no one has the solutions. No one had silver bullet to say, okay, this is the direction, we are going to solve that. And I have to say, and what I'm going to say, that maybe it's a little bit provocative, but some discourses about missions don't help much. Because in uncertainty context, we cannot have clear objectives of what we want to achieve in 20 years, in 10 years. We have seen the results of many decisions by researchers, big players about energy, what the consequences had on agriculture. No, it's much more complicated, and we should be more less humble, no? And no one has solutions, so we need to rethink many things. I'm optimist. I'm very realistic, but I think we need a drastic change also in our discussions between researchers, between policymakers. No one has solutions, not so many recommendations, and it's not helping a lot that researchers only recommend policymakers what to do, because many times what they recommend is impossible to do, because policymaker is like a black box. Politics, interests at the local, regional, national level, it's so complex. It's not a black box.
I guess that's why we're here together, at least in this session.
But we need to have different questions.
Right.
And try to have more holistic views. And I think that what would help is to focus on the challenges and then ask, what can do the different parts do for this challenge? And how can we work together in different ways? And this would be a place to start. But starting with action, showing things, and it works or it doesn't work. And then we reorient, but start actions.
Okay, see, it sounds like some recommendations after all, so that's very helpful, but at least not coming from another academic. Dimitris, you were leaning forward.
I'm inspired by Tatiana as usual. I think that the role that consumers have in and the different the role of consumers in industrial transitions and of households is very different varies a lot across places. One wonderful thing about the modern world is that individuals have a lot more information available. We have distributed agency, but also greater ways, more powerful ways to exercise agency, to take decisions. And that's why I think an important role of policy is to empower distributed agents, be they consumers or other individuals, users, with better information. That's a key role for public policy. It's a public good that won't normally be provided, not for free. So we need to create this evidence. We need to make this evidence more relevant. We need to also recognize that consumers are in many respects ahead of governments. And there are many surveys across Europe of consumer sentiment that show that in many countries, private citizens are a lot more demanding of their governments. They would like to see bolder climate goals, for example. Solid majorities, in fact. So yet at the same time, governments take decisions that influence demand by consumers, such as, for example, regulating the kinds of consumption or use choices of specific technologies. And these have very clear industrial implications. And it's surprising that they're not that these implications are not always appreciated. So there is a pressing need for policymakers in the broader innovation and industrial policy arena to strengthen their capacity to develop evidence-based policy that takes into account demand of all shapes and sizes, not just the demand that the government generates with its own budget, but also the demand that consumers generate. It was traditionally thought that businesses do that sufficiently, but this is not always true. This is not always true. Not when you have these very large breaks in consumption patterns that we see now in transitions.
Okay, thank you for this for adding this. Yeah, we have only a few minutes left, but actually it's fine that we don't cover the last topic, because that was the one on managing vested interest, and that was of course hard to escape in the earlier topic. So I think you already shared your views on what to do with the big players and the incumbents. What I still had in the back of my mind, Taran, was that you didn't promise us to tell us more about the governance tools, but you had some slides. I said we might get back to that, and I thought I hope so. So maybe just briefly, because we have only a few minutes, but rather than me summarizing now the stuff you just heard, is there anything you think this is overlooked in terms of governance tools, or anything that might be very powerful in terms of the challenges we just discussed and isn't being discussed or applied so much yet?
Yes, thank you. It's interesting to listen to the discussion by Tatiana and Dimitros as well about kind of focusing on demand and so on. But I guess we have covered a lot of these issues about policy tools. But I guess one discussion, just to bring a fine point here, is about the kind of phase out type of approach. And I think it's easy to converge and make tools for these more kind of accelerator missions, the kind of the broader transforming sectors. And particularly if you want to phase out something, it's a completely different game. And I don't think that we've looked even kind of scratched the surface of it, and whether or not it's actually feasible at all as a policy to phase out an industry, I'm actually quite uncertain. It's kind of policymakers, they focus on what's an attainable policy, right? So it's the art of making something happen. So I think it's also about seeing the limits of where policy can actually make a difference. And I think Tatiana and Dimitros also pointed to that. So in terms of policy tools, there's kind of making it less attractive, not necessarily having tools to support something, but just kind of take away the advantages. And I think in the chat here, one comment is on that kind of, wouldn't just industry life cycles mean that industries will kind of die out, right? And maybe yes, maybe no, but I think at least there's something you could do to slowly try to reorient industries. But so I think that's an issue that we don't really know that much about. And even we should, as researchers, at least go into and see is that really feasible. But overall, I think we can do very many different things. But real change in terms, at least industry transformations, will probably require quite bold moves and a lot of kind of power from different stakeholders. And I'm not sure that consumers could be kind of the answer to that, but certainly. It's a complicated to switch off what's actually very kind of a big source of income and so on in regions and countries. I have a hard time seeing a politician that would just put the plug on something which is a very important source of income. So, but I think that discussion is something that we need to continue.
Sorry, wrong button. Yeah, great. I think that's a very good agenda point for those scholars and practice and policy practitioners that still feel encouraged to work on those topics. So the phase out yeah, we didn't discuss it much because it's also still very hard to say many things about it, apart from what was said in terms of engaging participants and agendas and finding alternatives. Yeah, that's wonderful. Iris, we haven't heard you, but there
That's
weren't
right.
that many questions.
No,
And
and
the- and
our
the panel-
speakers picked them up
Yeah,
immediately. So there was no job for me. So that's great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much to our speakers. Yeah, I found it a very interesting and inspiring discussion. So yeah.
Yeah, me too. So thanks also from our side, and yeah, I can only concur with the last comment in the comment that it would be good to keep exchanging thoughts when it comes to mission-oriented policy. I didn't introduce that, but some of us are involved in the Mission-Oriented Policy Observatory, so we kind of have the ambition to bring policymakers and scholars together to think on when do missions work, because as Tatiana mentioned, they don't always are a good idea or well implemented. But indeed, if anyone in the audience wants to know more, I'm sure you can get in touch with any of the speakers. So thank you so much. It was a very insightful conversation, and I hope to see you in another venue like this or in real life. All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.